toward.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Like, I was going to say, like, between balancing that and being a therapist, and it's like, what else can't you do? Jeez.
I don't waste a lot of
Man.
time. You know, you got one life to live. You got to make the most of it.
I love it.
Yeah.
Do you play a stand-up bass or an electric bass, or do you
I have a stand-up, but I haven't played that a lot. I play mostly electric, 5, 6 strings. Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm the oldest of 11 kids. I don't know if you know that.
Wow, is that right?
Yep, and they're all from the same mom and dad. We're all one big old
Wow.
happy family. And several of my siblings, like Ryan maybe had mentioned before, I play the piano, but I also play the cello too. But I have several of my siblings play stringed instruments. They play the string bass as well. In fact, one of my brothers just graduated from the U the other month, the degree in classical bass. So I feel like you guys would get along really well. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow. So what number are you in the family? What number are you?
Number 1.
You're the oldest?
The oldest.
Get out of here. Wow.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? I know. My youngest brother came home when I was 18, so he was literally my 18th birthday present.
Wow.
So yeah, and today's
that's amazing.
And today's my youngest sister's birthday. So after this is done, I'm gonna be giving her a call real quick.
Okay.
So.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, that's great.
I usually come down to the Twin Cities often for work. So next time I'm down there, I'll have to meet up with you and we'll have to jam or something.
There's up for it.
So cool. Look at this, Ryan.
I'm regular, you know.
So guys, those that are viewing and on Facebook, thank you so much. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties, but praise the Lord that we are through it. Welcome again to part 4 of Candid Conversations. On Monday, we talked about a trophy killing. Tuesday, evangelicalism's response, and we went into the theology behind why mostly in some evangelical circles, they are slow to respond and partner with and champion the idea of social justice, and why the relationship is primarily vertical and not horizontal. And then on Wednesday, we had the pleasure again of our theologian, Dr. Kenneth Young, and we talked about Jesus and justice, and what we tried to show that while Jesus was alive as part of the divine plan for humanity, it's about relationship with God and relationship with others, and you really can't have one without the other. And tonight, we're going to be talking about Minnesota Nice by the numbers. We understand when it comes to race and race relations and what has happened with George Floyd, you know, there's always a section of people who says we really don't understand what the issue is. We can't put a finger on it. We don't believe in systemic racism. We believe that if you work hard in America, that you can get everything that you put your minds to. And usually the African-American diverse communities are saying, listen, that's not our story. That's not our experience. So tonight we're going to talk about Minnesota Nice by the numbers. And with us, we have Dr. Charles Morgan, who is the CEO of the Union Gospel Mission. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist. And also joining us is Brianna. I have it as Drevlo right now. Okay. Brianna has been a part of pageants, right, here in Minnesota, and has represented Minnesota nationally, right? So that's what we're gonna say. She is a trained pianist, highly proficient, and presently works in rheumatology. All right. So we are going to jump in, but before we begin the conversation, I would like to play just about 3 minutes of a video, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we shall be off.
The problem with the Madison Jackson and William Simpson incident is people had to show up in their front yard and threaten them. And this was in 1909. I don't think it's any coincidence that in May of 1910, the first racial covenant shows up in South Minneapolis. I'm pretty sure I know who wrote that covenant, and that was one Edmund G. Walton. He was a real estate developer. The legacy he left on Minneapolis, I mean, there's Edmund Boulevard, there's all these additions with his last name. Really, probably the most important and the worst was this legacy of racial covenants.
So when people purchase a home, traditionally you get an abstract package, and it shows every time your property, the property that you've just purchased, changed hands. And in Minneapolis, properties that were platted after 1910 are very likely to have these racial restrictions embedded in the property deed.
Covenants can be building covenants, they can be setback requirements, but the racial covenants that we're concerned with tells you who can or cannot live, lease, even occupy certain spaces.
Racially restrictive covenants, private contracts between individuals that allow them to dictate to whom they'll sell their property.
Identifying racial covenants, however, has proved remarkably challenging. The only way to find racial covenants are to read warranty deeds. We're looking at about 3 million deeds in Hennepin County between 1900 and 1960, and each deed on average runs about 3 pages. So we're in the ballpark of 10 million or so pages of text. Penny found about 4,000, 5,000 racial covenants by herself. The old-fashioned way. She just went down to the county recorder's office and started going through deeds. And she found several thousand racially restrictive covenants. And that was enough to get us thinking, okay, hey, maybe we can do more than just show that racial covenants were a practice that was used in Minneapolis. What if we can map all of them? The first map that Penny made was shocking. I was shocked when I saw this, and I was shocked when she started reading me some of the language of these racial covenants.
The wording can be very different. They're working on early 20th century ideas of race.
Chinese, Japanese, Negro, Moorish, Turkish,
Mongolian,
Hebrew, sometimes Semitic.
people of African blood or descent. No Negroes or Jews. Only Caucasians, except for their domestic servants of a different race who might be domiciled with the owner.
Many of them were written during the period where eugenics is at front and center of American scientific thought, and that language is often what you see in these deeds.
Only people of the Aryan race can inhabit this land.
Or the Aryan branch of the Caucasian race.
I think one of the surprising things that I've found in this research is 100% of these covenants are aimed at African Americans.
Okay. Okay. So Dr. Charles.
Yes.
So you just saw the video and we talked about, they were talking about racial covenants, and I'll toss it to you. A lot of people may not understand what a racial covenant is. Can you just expound on what the video was implying?
Yeah, a racial covenant is where real estate agents working with banks and other agencies restricted the purchase of homes in specified areas against people of color, specifically African Americans. And so if you went to the bank to buy a home in a certain area, you may not get the loan approved, or real estate agents would not show you the homes, or if you liked a home in an area that was covenanted, the bank would not give you a loan. Therefore, you would not be able to purchase that home.
Okay. So what does that mean for wealth development with regards to the fact that home ownership coming up 1900s was a huge American, I guess, product, right? With regards to being able to build wealth. How does that restriction flesh out?
Is very critical, because one of the most important things in the transfer of wealth is the ability to buy and own property. And so if you're being discriminated against, for instance, with the GI Bill in New Jersey, there were some 67,000 GI loans given. and less than 300 of those loans were given to African Americans. And if you look across the United States and you look at some of the statistical information where the GI Bill was supposed to help veterans coming back, you can see disproportionately and discriminatively that those loans were divvied out mostly to white people, and African Americans in particular were pretty much left out of the entire scene, which means that African Americans have an inability to transfer wealth because of their inability to own the kinds of property that will allow them to accrue equity in the home and therefore transfer that wealth to their children.
Mm-hmm.
Very serious stuff.
Mm-hmm. Brianna, how did that video strike you? I'll just let you jump in.
Yeah. Okay. So I was not, I mean, I'd heard the terms like redlining, for example. I think that's a fairly modern term that many of us have heard before. I've heard of banks, you know, not giving loans to people. I've heard of some of these things happening, but when I heard about these initially, they were framed in this, oh, well, that only happens in the South, or that only happens. I think I heard about a case study one time from the New York Times that it happened in like Philadelphia or something. Like, it happens away. It doesn't happen here, right? And so to hear about the history of racial covenants, especially in Minneapolis, in a place where I think my kind of perception of Minnesota is that we tout ourselves to be such progressive people, right? In everything we do, we are progressive. We are whatever. But when you hear about this and just how steeped racial inequality is when it comes to housing and wealth for African American communities, to me, it totally like took me like a complete, like, it just like my head started spinning and I was like, what in the actual F is going on here? This is ridiculous. And why is this something we're finding out really, and it's coming to light now? You know, I mean, that was like, what, 100 years ago, and you're still seeing these inequalities happening today. In the Twin Cities today, I heard a statistic that 3/4 of white families own homes, but only one quarter of Black families do. So you can clearly see that that's still something that's happening today. And to me, it took me by total surprise, and it's I don't know, it's been something I've been really fascinated to learn more about. And like the documentary said, I looked at that as a map, and I was just, like I said, completely shocked by just how spread out throughout the Twin Cities it was. It wasn't just one little place. It's in communities everywhere. And you can still see some of that today when you look at the makeup of certain suburbs and communities in the Twin Cities area.
And our home ownership rate is one of the lowest in the nation.
So repeat that again, sir, Doctor.
That about a quarter of African American families, especially in Minneapolis, own their homes, and that's one of the lowest home ownership rates in the United States.
Yeah, I would let that sink in with our viewers. I'll let that sink in. And if it's not clear, we're going to kind of keep marinating this, because we really want people to understand what that means. Is that World War I, World War II, when these Black professionals that went in and fought for the country, engineers, right, people that fought for the country, came back home to their domicile to be a part, to be received, they were told, you can't get the American dream. Your dream has to be in this part of the neighborhood, right? Not over here. And what does that mean? If you can't buy a home, let's say someone buys a home, it's $6 for the home, okay? A year after, it's $8 for the home. Now you can take $1 from that home and you could go get a nice cabin in northern Minnesota. All that time, the Black professional is still renting, okay? Many of them are still renting. So 2 years from that, now your home is worth $12. You can go start a business. Right? So with racial covenants, it means if someone wants to sell the home to a person of color, the language is in there that says you can even be sued by your neighbors.
Because you violated the covenant, yeah. You violated the agreement.
I think that section of the covenant right there, that you could sue if someone sold, even if it was their property and it was their intent to sell it, like you were saying, to that soldier that comes home that wants to have the American dream, fought for the same flag, fought for the same country, gave his all, comes back, and yet you could have every intent to want to sell to that person, and yet your next door neighbor says, you do that and I'm going to sue you for selling your property. I mean, if that doesn't speak also to, the freedom to do what you please in this country, I mean, really, like, that, I think that part of the whole issue of covenants, that little kind of snippet right there, I think that for me really did it in terms of like I said, completely spinning me on my head. And like, how could that even be a thing? Like, how could you do that? But yet you could. You totally could. And it happened.
And it was broadly practiced. If you're familiar with Carl and Ann Braden down in Louisville, Kentucky, they bought a home for a black family called called the Wades. And so they went and purchased that home because the Wades could not purchase it in that area of the city. And when they found out that the home would be owned by blacks, boy, they had a big explosion of people reacting. They labeled Ann and Carl Braden as communists and so on and so forth. And it was really bad. They blew up the part of the home, just really serious stuff. So this has been the history of our nation, and it's coming to light now in ways that I think people are willing to accept the reality of it.
And it's interesting that when people did that and they blew up homes or they picketed and they made such a riot and they ruined and damaged property, those people weren't considered thugs or protesters. No,
absolutely not.
They were not considered to be people. They were pretty good people, weren't they? They were just trying to protect their community.
They were upholding the race. They were being faithful to the race. And that was kind of psychological way to circumvent any guilt or sense of wrongdoing.
No kidding.
So Dr. Morgan, I have a question, because we're just looking at one part. The racial covenants is just one part of it. There are other parts we'll go into. But I want you to try to paint a picture, because I was trying to find if there's any research about, if we looked at like from 1910 all the way up to now based on racial covenants, how much money was drawn out of the African-American dream or African-American community. And we couldn't really find any number. What I did find is that every year, homes within certain areas in Minneapolis depreciates about, I think, 43,000 or something like that based on that. But the question I want to ask you, because I want the viewers to understand the humanity of it. And if you don't understand the humanity of it, or if you see the humanity of it and still hold on to your perceptions, then you have to ask yourself the question, why? Okay? So what does it mean, in your opinion, Dr. Morgan, for someone to come home from the war, right? Not get the home. What does it mean for that person's family and for the next generation of that person's family, financially and emotionally? We're talking mental health.
Well, I heard a figure recently where it would take African Americans 100 years to catch up based upon the way things have progressed in the past and are progressing now. That's a long time. Now, you have to contextualize this. Now, you have to realize that when soldiers came back from World War II, some of those soldiers were killed for being in the uniform. So you have to remember that in contextually, owning a home probably wasn't a big priority when you're looking at trying to make sure you keep your life and keep your family safe. And so terrorism was a viable way in society to prevent people from even dreaming. In other words, the dream would be crushed through terrorizing individuals. And then your aspirations would go from aspiring to own a home to aspiring to be alive tomorrow. And so when you're looking at the psychological and emotional damage of that cross-generationally and the multi-generational trauma being passed down through decades, it doesn't take a whole lot to realize why African Americans are in the condition they are within terms of their own self-esteem, internalized senses of inferiority, and all the things that are constantly undergirded and reinforced in our community on a daily basis about your value and worth as a person of color.
Dr. Morgan, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
So I can just hear, like you went through, and I totally am on board with everything you're saying. I can hear some of those folks that are not understanding this coming and rebuttaling, saying something like, well, that was almost 100 years ago, and you said they need 100 years to catch up, so shouldn't they be caught up by now? What would you say to somebody who said something like that?
I would say,
how would you make it respond? Because I hear responses like that, and I get,
yeah.
honestly, I get angry. I'm like, ah,
well, I think if the ground was an equal playing field, that might be a legitimate rebuttal. But you systemically have roadblocks in our institutions that historically have set people up to not be able to accomplish their economic dreams. So it's like asking a person to run a 100-yard dash with no legs and say, well, we gave you the opportunity to run the race.
that's a really like tactful way of
Hey, that sounds like a street joke. Oh man.
And I think that's why, when I talk to audiences and stuff, all white audiences, and I want to say I'm encouraged on this level because audiences were asking me to come and speak even before the George Floyd murder and stuff like that, because there are people who are genuinely concerned about addressing the inequities they see in our society. I co-chaired the Itasca Project with CEOs of large companies across Minnesota that sincerely want to hire people of color, but are lacking some information and maybe the tools that are required to be able to build the relationships and create the kinds of environments that would be conducive to recruiting Blacks and at the same time being able to keep Blacks in employ in a predominantly white state. And so there are some encouraging things going on behind the scenes, just like there were with the abolitionists and Christians who were seriously committed to helping slaves get to freedom. We have that kind of thing happening today, and I think we have to be careful to be balanced in our assessment of reality, and to be able to be balanced in what we see and what we do, because we don't want to be reactionary. And we also want to be able to identify those who are coming alongside, those who are advocating, and not put everybody in the same box. I think that's tremendously important.
Wow.
Eloquent.
Yes. This guy.
I don't even know what to say.
I say that too because, being a CEO, I travel in circles where you don't have a lot of African Americans in upper echelon positions. And so what that means is that you don't have a lot of African Americans who are able to really see some of the genuine things that are going on in the upper echelon level with individuals who have achieved great success, but are, for lack of a better word, convicted because they see the reality of what's going on around them. And some of them have achieved their success knowing that it's been at the expense of other people. In some cases.
Yeah. So do you feel, because it seems like the streets are talking now, right? So there has been time that's been given, right? I mean, we're talking about, so if we're talking about Minnesota, we talk about a racial covenant, that's one thing, right? We explain why we're, like you said, we're second worst state for African American wealth in the nation. Okay, we had a couple real great Black neighborhoods that were doing really well. They ran 94 through it and destroyed it. Right, that's happened all the way across the country. So as we know, well-meaning Minnesota nice folks has been dishing out some stuff behind the scenes that their community don't really need to know specifically. They don't have to read the deed because the deed's in the community, right? It's in your theological framework of how things are. But now we're at a place where it seems like even generations younger than myself, like Brianna and even younger, are saying, we're not really waiting for conversations anymore, right? I saw a gal hold up a sign, you know, we're not your grandfather's civil rights, right? We would burn stuff down, right? That's the idea. So they're saying we've waited for process, right? We've seen the history, and we're asking, how is it as humans that we can allow this to happen, and yet still you expect us to not, become enraged or
Well,
respond?
let me address a couple of things. First of all, it makes me angry when I hear people say stuff like, you older folks have had the baton, you ran and not really
Yes.
accomplished anything, and we're gonna go now and we're gonna take care of this.
Yeah.
I'm all for empowering young people to get out there. I think that the song "Glory" says it really well. It takes the wisdom of the elders and the energy and the strength of the young to
Yes.
be able to accomplish the things that need to be accomplished. Because see, I grew up in the Deep South. I drank from colored fountains. I went to theaters, had to sit in the colored section. I've heard people call my dad a nigger and have to go to the back door to get his family something to eat.
Yes.
I've lived the green book, traveling to take my siblings
Yeah. The
to
green
college
book.
and have to, be careful where
Yes.
to stop. We had to go
Yes.
through Alabama, Mississippi, whatever. I've lived that. I've also lived the reality of people losing their lives fighting
Mm.
the Reverend George Lee being shot to death in Mississippi. Jimmy Lee Jackson, all these people that have given their lives in order to get us to where we are today. And what
Today.
I say to them is, I say, do you really know how bad it was? You
Fear.
think you know, but let me tell you how bad it was because I've lived it. This is not something I've read in the book. I've
Mhm.
lived it. And I tell you, it damages you to the core of your being. I'm a therapist and I'm still working on myself today at my age because of the scarring that I got growing up, seeing some of the things and hearing some of the things and being virtually invisible in a society that should have affirmed me. And it's not for being in a private school with nuns and priests who really reverse some of the negativity. And what I say sometimes is sometimes you need a person to give you back what's been taken from you. And that person needs to look like the person that took it from you.
Come on, preach.
And
Preach it.
so in my life, those white nuns and those people who spoke into my life to say, that is not the reality of who you are.
Mm.
It would not have had the same impact coming from a black person because we had already been devalued.
Yes.
And so our opinion of one another gets devalued. You see
Yes.
what I'm saying? So a
Woo.
lot of times people don't know the paradigms and the dynamics and the depth of what happens to a person growing up in an environment like that. And because they don't know, they can assume that people have not done incredible feats
Mhm.
despite all odds to get us to where we are today.
Mhm. Mhm. Whew. That's why we're having this conversation, and that's why we've been doing this all night, right? We pretty much want our white brothers and sisters to understand what's going on, because the truth is, what's the word you use? The repairing,
Repairment,
the
repairment.
repairment, in essence, has to come from white folks that says, man, our eyes have opened now. We can solve it.
Well,
Because a
Dr.
lot of
King said that 50 years ago
yeah,
because black households own 1/10 of the wealth of white households. So if you don't have the means economically to deliver yourself, you need people who have the means
come
who
on.
identify with your struggle to come alongside of you, which is a biblical concept that
Yeah.
those who have may share what they have, those who have not, that there might be an equality. That's the word of God.
That's the word.
That's not socialism. That's
Yes.
compassion.
Come on. Woo, Brianna, jump in. Try to ride that. Try to ride that Holy
I don't.
Ghost there.
Well, I see. I'm in this I'm totally in sponge mode right now because I'm just listening. Well, I think okay. And so, Dr. Morgan, you talk about your experiences of, growing up and seeing and living this narrative every single day. And for a second, I go back and I'm like, well, what was my childhood like? I grew up in a completely white neighborhood. I grew up in a small town in Minnesota where I think I had one African-American classmate for 1 year in 7th grade. 1 year. After that, it was pretty much like all white kids and then like one Native kid. And that's it. I mean, we didn't have all of that stuff. And I think about, well, I mean, was I made fun of? Yeah, I mean, every kid gets picked on at some point, but like, I was never harassed for what for the color of my skin. I was never, my parents never experienced any sort of inequalities based on who they were, their backgrounds, their heritage, and none of that. And I just think to myself, like, I can't even imagine the amount of repair and the amount of anguish that people that deal with that every single day deal with.
It's profoundly damaging.
And I mean, I can't even imagine. And I'm someone that I try my best to like try to think. I can't even begin to even think what that would be like. You know, it's so funny. I hear, folks who get called out, for being racist or saying something. And it's not like they're, you say it gently, like, hey, what you said is kind of racist and this is why it needs to change. And white people are just so fragile about it. I'm sure you both have heard the book, The White Fragility.
One of the best books I've ever read on race.
I read it back in January and it completely, like, I started rereading it again the other night. So I was like, I want to read this again. And like, you need to soak this in, but it's how fragile people are. They get so defensive that, well, I mean, I grew up poor and I don't understand why, I'm not scarred by it. Well, but you also weren't dealing with systemic racism. You weren't also dealing with terror and threats. And what I've learned, I've just learned that people who deal with that kind of stuff, I mean, it's no wonder that their growth as a human being can be significantly stunted because you don't have the mental capacity in your head to think big. You have to worry about yourself and your safety every single day. And it's no wonder why people are experiencing inequality this way. And so as white people, we have to recognize that our Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, our brothers and sisters, are dealing with this trauma, whether we can internalize it or not. And I think that's a big thing for white people. Just because you can't internalize it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
True.
So
right.
that is such a big thing. And that's something that, like I said, I hear about your childhood and your experiences, and I can't even begin to imagine what that's like for you. And I'm sorry that you've dealt with that. Both of you and Ryan, how you've dealt with that with your entire life. I can't even begin. And I'm only 26. I haven't even experienced the breath of life. And already I'm like, this is why things need to change.
Well, I see good can come out of it because I can speak to the present experientially, where a lot of people can't. And I can tell people in reality what it does to a person inside. It's not something I read about. It's something I've lived. And I tell people, by and large, white people can live their lives without encountering a Black person. But Black people, by necessity, must engage white people in order to survive. And so every day you wake up, you realize you're a Negro, or you realize you're Black, or you realize you're African American. However you want to label it, you realize that you have a battle to fight every day because of the skin, the color of your skin. It's just a reality.
Well, just all the microaggressions too that lead up to it, that, you might be, like I had mentioned, coming from a small town, you might have been that one Black kid in the minority and surrounded by white people and no other Black people, but the microaggressions and the, everything, the little cuts to the big cuts that you experience every day. I mean, that, like I said, I can't even fathom the toll that takes. And I'm sure it continues to take as well. It's a continual everyday thing. You can't escape it. It's not like you can just walk out of the room, and say, oh, well, out in the wide world, there's no racism. So if I'm not here and I'm out there, it's fine. I'm not. You're experiencing that no matter where you are. You cannot run away and hide from it. And I think that's something that people need to understand. This is not something you can just cover your head under a pillow and just say, this doesn't exist. It does. It does everywhere.
And something as subtle as as a therapist, I talk to others and I say, even the terminology of micro and macro aggressions is now focusing on the perpetrator. It should be micro and macro injury from the person that's receiving the aggression. So even sometimes when we craft terms to explain things, it's done from the perspective of the person that's superior.
That I like that. I really like
Brianna,
that.
you gotta pay for
Micro
that. You gotta pay for that.
No, you know what? I like that. You know what? And I will own that. I'm going to use that from now on because
Yeah.
I didn't think of it that way. Microaggression.
Most people don't. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, micro
Yeah.
injury and macro injury.
Mhm.
Because when I experience it,
Yeah.
that's what it is. It's a dart,
Yeah.
right? That's how so we will be like, was that that's like some microaggression.
That
But
aggression leads to
because
injury.
it's
You
an
are
injury. Injury.
right.
And white folks are good at that.
All right,
I'm
white
just
people,
saying.
if you're listening, micro injury, macro injury. I really like
Passive
that.
aggressive, right? Passive aggressive, that passive aggressive thing, right?
And I think that's something that we often don't really process in our society, that even our language is crafted from the posturing of superiority.
Yeah.
And when you begin to realize that, then you can begin to realize the impact of always trying to swim up through that so you can be heard as a minority, where conversation is not, you're always one down.
Now my brain
You're
is
thinking. I see you thinking. Yeah.
But that is like that gives me it gives me a kind of reference of the movie Get Out, the sunken place, right? That sunken place.
I haven't seen Get Out, so I'm gonna.
Because of the things like you said, you have to swim up through. There's so much effort and energy in order to be heard because you're trying to navigate all of the
You're trying to navigate being one down. For instance, when you go into the bank to get a loan, you already standing in the hole because you're thinking you're going to be denied that loan because of the color of your skin. And how can you get around the presupposition that you're not qualified for it? And how can you speak in such a way that you're deemed worthy to get that loan? So you got to go through all this stuff
Right.
to just sit down and talk about getting a loan. You got to work through all of that first. You got to swim through all of that before you can even have the conversation.
I put my hand up for
putting
that
in
right
all that-
here. I put my hand up for that. I put two hands up.
Well, like you were saying, it's just all that extra effort that you have to put in before you can even get to the starting line. Whereas a white person, I mean, as someone like myself, I can, put on a respectable outfit and walk in all proper, and it's going to be really not much of a problem. Now, maybe a little bit if I'm young, but I mean, they're not going to look at me quite the same. And I think that that's something people don't inherently realize until they talk to somebody who's lived those experiences and they can start having these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what's really important about conversations like this.
Mm-hmm. And, when we were growing up, we would hear, you have to be twice as good as the white person to even be considered. So psychologically, you're already thinking, I almost have to be a superhuman just to be human.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what I know. I've had colleagues at work. The company I work for has got quite a diverse. I'm very proud to say that they've got a very diverse workforce, and one of my upper management team, they're African American. They served in our military and very respectful. But I know he's told stories of how he has to be so incredibly professional and you have to use if there's the whiter version of your name, you have to use that, and you have to speak in perfect dialect, and you have to hold yourself just right, and you have to be wearing just the right clothes and be in the right place at the right time. And that's just such a stressful thing for to just for white people. That's stressful to have to be respectable, but then to add all these extra things on top of it and fight through those pressures and for Black people. And I just think that that's, like I said, I can't fathom the amount of stress. I think I knowing myself, I would probably crumble underneath that. And I'm constantly shocked by the people that are continuously resilient through it, because, you know, again, white fragility. I would just crumble. You know, I mean, white people get so upset when their opinions are challenged, let alone then having to deal with all this extra stress in their life. I mean, I think it gives a lot of food for thought for people to really think about that.
And you know,
what would
guys,
your life be like if you had to deal with that?
And you know, when I'm talking to people, I'm trying to get them not to be so naive about the structural racism that we are encountering, that thankfully is coming to the surface. In Washington, D.C., we have some 15,000 lobbyists. Now, who do you think they're lobbying for? They're certainly not lobbying for the middle class. And in 2019, I think they spent $3.7 billion in order for special interests to be able to get done what they need to get done. And so if we are naive to think that we don't have some serious kind of things that we need to really look at how are we being affected as people, not only as African Americans, but as middle class people, where the middle class is disappearing. Because the strategy has been, if you know Noam Chomsky or you know Robert Reich, they've been trying to teach us for years and decades. It says first attack solidarity. Then it says reduce democracy and increase inequality. So when you look at Aristotle, they knew that they were going to be the people who have the people who have nots, but Aristotle said, well, don't decrease democracy, decrease inequality. But Madison and some of the framers of the Constitution, when they dealt with the same thing, they said, okay, that's just equality thing. We're going to decrease democracy and increase inequality so we can keep the rabble in line and keep the decision making into the hands of the elite.
Well, that's exactly what happened. In which was it, the Emancipation? Which amendment was that again? I can't remember the number, but where they have that loophole when they talk about, you know, that free people, you know, people shall be free from slaves except
the Emancipation Proclamation.
Except for if they commit the crime. I mean, that is just, there are little loopholes like that throughout the entire Constitution and all sorts of government policies. And when you say these special lobbyists as well, there are all these different types of loopholes coming into effect, whether you know it or not. And I think that's the thing that people don't recognize either, is that they just don't think it exists. Well, it does in literally everything you do. I mean, yeah.
And the point needs advocacy. And we need people who are not only financially strong, but who are intellectually strong as well, that's able to unravel some of these things in a way that the common people can understand. Because if you know Walter Lippmann, those guys, you know, they would say stuff like, you know, the general public, they're like the bewildered herd. They need to be led, right? So that's not the concept of democracy. So when you think of covenants, when you think of being able to divvy out the GI Bill, leaving it to states, where you know that states are going to be discriminative in their policies, you keep the system together, although it might appear that you're working for the common man.
But it's not.
And so these things are complex. They're not just simplistic stuff where we get in the street and we voice, because Dr. King said, what are we going to do against the United States Army? What are we going to do against a militarized police force? What are you actually going to do? I mean, at the end of the day, really? You see what I'm saying? So Dr. King and those guys, when they did their thing, they did it from a moral framework, meaning that if you're going to go and you're going to have a moral movement in terms of justice, you can't accomplish it with immoral rhetoric and immoral activity, because you have no foundation. You're saying you're no better than the guy who's now abusing you, because what is going to be the rails to keep you and to do well towards your fellow man if you get the power.
After you get what you want.
Right. And when we see around the world, right, we see revolutions and stuff, people promising to people. And what we see when people get too distraught, they will accept a tyrant to rule them in order to bring back order. And we need to see that around the world, right?
Yeah, that's the model. That's the model. They gave up their rights, right?
In order to have order.
In order to have order, yes. Yeah.
Right.
So I want to shift it, and I want to.
I'm enjoying this, by the way.
Yeah, this is great. This is like
This is
great.
awesome,
Yeah,
yeah.
a lot of people are watching it and enjoying it and sharing.